Messianic Arian Radio. Only one God.
Hello, this is Elisel Rodriguez, and this is the Arian Orthodox Church. Today, we are going to talk about a very unusual topic to talk about, but it is very important, and it is essential to the future of Arianism and the truth of God. So today we're going to be talking about Jews in Arianism and what that looks like. So I don't think I've ever made a video to try to explain my position on how Jews would operate in Arianism, because Arianism is very much like Judaism in the fact that Jesus is not God Almighty. Jews always believe that. But what does it look like in Arianism? So I want to give you an explanation. I want to show you what the belief system is. So Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. He came to the Jews first. Jesus came to promote and continue on the religion of the Jews. And this has always been the intention of Jesus, to come to the Jews. Unfortunately, they rejected him, like he was rejected in how Joseph was rejected by his brothers and thrown in a pit, and obviously eventually came back to him. But it was God's will that this issue happened, that this situation happened, so that Joseph could become in the highest position possible and to be able to help the Jews. This is what God is doing, and what happened with Jesus and the Jews was something that was supposed to happen, and mistakes were made, and whatever happens, the truth is all things work together for good to those who love God. Now, Jews in Arianism is a little different than what it would look like in Gentiles. So in Judaism, if a Jew and a Gentile were going to the same synagogue, the expectations of the Gentiles is different. The Gentiles are only under the Noahide laws, and the Jews are under the Jewish law. This is understood in Judaism. In Arianism, in Arian Judaism, in post-Jesus times, the differentiation hasn't changed. Because the Gentiles have come to the pinnacle of relationship with God without the law, they are not under the traditional laws of ritualism and all of that stuff. Jews, on the other hand, have promised and devoted themselves to God and said that they will operate under the law. And I'm going to prove to you that the Jews did in the church. So Christian Jews were operating under Jesus in Arianism in the early church. So there was a council of Jerusalem where the Pharisaical Jews, Pharisaical Christians or Arians, when the Pharisees, who were Christians at that time, wanted to demand that the Gentiles had to get circumcised so that they could reap the benefits of the Messiah. Because they believed at the beginning that they needed to be circumcised to be part of Israel so that they can reap the benefits of the Messiah, that had to be done first. And Paul given revelation through Jesus, said the Gentiles do not have to do such things because they did not have a covenant in that area, and so they have come to God without works. And the Jews themselves also come to God without works through Christ. But the difference is that the Jews have a relationship with God that's longer than the Gentiles. And the Gentiles are coming to Christ without the law. The Jews have always traditionally been doing the law, and they promised that they and their generations afterwards will always follow the law and be doing those priestly things that need to be done, required by God. So in Judaism, when the Messiah comes, Jesus said, heaven and earth, when heaven and earth passes away, then the law will be passed away. But technically right now, it's not one jot, not one tittle is going to be taken away. But Paul was preaching a different message to the Gentiles. And there was controversy on that fact. And the Christian Jews wanted to impose this taking the circumcision, because if you circumcise yourself, then you're actually under the law. Just because you're trying to follow the law does not mean that you are under the law. You are only truly under the law when you circumcise yourself. Paul said, look, no circumcision for the Gentiles. They don't need it. You guys promised, Jews promised that they would follow these laws and have the obligation to do that because they made a promise. And so that's the issue. So Paul goes preaching, and the church decided, right? They made a council in Jerusalem. They decided, look, all we're going to require of the Gentiles is that they don't have sexual immorality, eat food sacrificed to idols, don't eat blood, sexual immorality, don't stay away from all of that stuff. And you're going to learn about the Mosaic law eventually. But circumcision is not going to be part of the church. So, the Gentiles. But when we look at Acts chapter 20, I believe it is, 19 or 20, let's see where it's at here. So let's go to 19. So in 21, in verse 20, in chapter 21, it says that Paul went to meet James in verse 18. So, and the day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and all of the elders were present. And when they had saluted them, he declared particularly that things God had wrought among the Gentiles. So Paul's talking about what's gone on with the Gentiles. Verse 20, and when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. So it's important to understand that Paul is saying, hey, look, I'm having great success in the Gentile world. This is what's going on. James, the leader of the church, says, hey, we're having great, awesome success in the Jewish area. And they start talking about all of these Jews are zealous for the law. That means they're excited about doing the law, excited about following the law, excited about doing all of that. So the Jewish Christians at that time were following the law under Christ. After accepting Jesus, they still followed the law. They still did the law fully. And so they made a differentiation, and then they said, hey, Paul, but we have an issue. The Jews around here have heard that you're telling Jews around Jerusalem, around the other places, not to circumcise themselves. And with all honesty, Paul was preaching to the Gentiles and saying, hey, look, you Gentiles, don't circumcise. If there's a couple of Jews here and there in there, he was not necessarily addressing them, but it came back to them that he never told them that. And so they were saying, look, you're not telling them, you're not differentiating and giving the idea to the Jews that they should circumcise. And so we have a problem with that, or they had a problem with that. And to remedy this, we want you to go and do the purifying of the ritual for purification at the temple, which involves being ritually clean and doing mikvah and all of this. So it's understandable that he is doing Jewish law. He is following the Jewish law. He's trying to show the Jews, hey, look, I am following the law just as well as you are. I am just telling the Gentiles not to circumcise themselves. That's all I'm telling them. But I'm not telling Jews not to circumcise or not follow the law. Look at me. I'm following the law right now. That's kind of what was being trying to be relayed there. So if we look, it's interesting. When we read in Galatians, and I think it's in chapter 1, it talks about how, in chapter 2 actually, it talks about how in verse 6 it says, but unto these who seem to be somewhat, whatsoever they were, it maketh no matter to me. God accepted no man's person. For they who seemed to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. But contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcised was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcised was unto Peter. It's interesting. He's saying, I'm preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised. So those who don't get circumcised, that's who I'm preaching to. And so Paul is preaching to the Gentiles. Paul is preaching to the Gentiles. He is trying to teach Gentiles, and they are the uncircumcision. He calls them, he says, I'm preaching the gospel of uncircumcision. So I'm preaching to those who do not get circumcised. The church, the part of the church that does not get circumcised, this is who I'm preaching to. And Peter, and you see later on in verse 9 that James, Peter, John, other ones are sent to the circumcision. So they are preaching to the circumcised. So their preaching is to the circumcision. So what we need to understand is that Paul is not preaching to Jews. His words, his writings are not intended for Jewish understanding. He's pointing to people who are not under the law, who are not circumcised, who are not under the law. That's what he's teaching. Peter, James, and John are teaching things that apply to Jews. So, and I'm not going to say that Jews don't have to listen to Paul or read what he has to say. Paul has great things to say about truth that needs to be understood. But whenever they read about the law and things that are offensive to them about the law, they need to keep in mind that he is speaking to uncircumcision, to those who are not under the law. And that he's not necessarily speaking to Jews in that section about that. He's speaking to a different demographic, a different situation. And so that Jews should read Paul to glean understanding, but to also realize that some of the stuff that he's saying is not necessarily pointed to the Jews. And then you have Peter, James, and John. So James is talking about the law and how I will show my works I will show my faith by my works and things like that. That's more of the law situation, and that's because he's preaching to to Jews, and not necessarily to Gentiles. Gentiles are more on the faith side, understanding, and Jews are trying to follow the law and operate in that way. So James is writing to a different situation in a different direction, and so we have to understand the differences. Some apostles or some of the writings are directed to Jews, and I'm not saying that Gentiles can't get anything from that. I'm saying you have to realize who they're talking to. And the Jews need to understand what's being said here. So, in a nutshell, to close this down, because I only got 1 minute here. So what we're trying to say is that Jews in Arianism or in post-messianic, messianic understanding in Judaism, because Arianism is Judaism, is a form of Judaism, is that the Jews can follow the law, whatever they want to do. If a Jewish Aryan wants to, and is a Levite by birth, wants to go out and operate in the temple when they build it again, if he wants to go to the temple, if he wants to teach in the temple, if he wants to operate any of the operations of the temple or temple worship or any of those things, is not wrong. I'm going to have to start another video. So this will be part 1. I'm going to go into a little deeper in the next video. But until then, hold that thought.